Interesting, thought-provoking, relevant, conversations that matters the most. Let's talk beyond the basics.
Let's take a deep dive into India's history during BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, the shift that silenced India's innovation when philosophy turned into faith. There's a pattern in human history that's impossible to ignore. When people think for themselves, civilizations rise. When people are told what to believe, civilizations stall. India's story makes this clearer than almost anywhere else. Let's look at the age of inquiry between the 700s BCE to 600 CE. For nearly 14 centuries, that is from the 8th century BCE to the 7th century CE, India was a global powerhouse of science, mathematics, and philosophy. This was the era of the Upanishads, where the focus was not worship but self inquiry. And here's a crucial clarification. India did have concepts of gods at that time, but it was mostly Vedic ritual deities Indra, Agni, Varuna. Their purpose was ritual and cosmic symbolism, not personal devotion. However, the philosophers at that time were focused on something entirely different: Brahman, not Brahma, the four headed creator god. Let me clarify. Are Brahman and Brahma the same? No, they are completely different concepts. Brahma, the four headed creator god, is a deity introduced in later Hindu mythology. He is part of the Trimurti: Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, Shiva, the destroyer. He has a form, personality, stories, temples, worshipped in Puranic traditions, a being who creates the universe in mythological narratives. This is a god, a person like entity. Whereas Brahman is the impersonal ultimate reality, not a god, not a person, not a creator, has no form, no attributes, no personality, described in the Upanishads as pure consciousness, the ground of existence, the essence of the self, which is Atman, which equals Brahman, cannot be worshipped, can only be realized through inquiry and understanding. This is a metaphysical principle, not a deity. The simplest analogy is to think of it like this: Brahma as a character in a story, Brahman is the laws of physics. One is a person like figure, the other is the underlying reality. They are not the same in any philosophical sense. What the Upanishads and early Advaita focused on was Brahman, the impersonal reality. That is why early Indian philosophy was rational, inquiry driven, introspective, non theistic, focused on consciousness, not worship. This is the intellectual climate that produced India's scientific breakthroughs. And in this time frame and the practice of questioning culture, India produced astonishing breakthroughs such as Panini, 5th century BCE, revolutionized linguistics. Shashtruda, 6th to 5th century BCE, documented surgical procedures. Aryabhatta, 5th century CE, proposed Earth's rotation. Brahmagupta, 7th century CE, formalized zero and negative numbers. These are historical facts. It clearly demonstrated that a culture built on questions produced breakthrough innovations. Now, here's the turning point: 8th to 9th century CE. This is the 700s to 800s CE, the era of Sankaracharya. Yes, he preserved Advaita's non dual philosophy, but he also made a major shift. He introduced a personal god, Ishvara, into the center of Advaita practice. Not Brahma, the mythological creator god, but Ishvara, a personal worship worthy god. This was new for Advaita. To clarify, Shankara preserved non dual philosophy at the level of ultimate truth, but introduced a personal God at the level of practical life. Therefore, for practical truth and everyday life, Sankaracharya introduced Ishvara, a personal God, creation, karma, devotion, rituals, temples, monastic institutions. He argued that most people cannot jump directly to the impersonal truth, so Ishvara becomes a stepping stone, a psychological and cultural tool. In his own words, paraphrased for clarity, Ishvara is real only from the practical standpoint, not from the ultimate standpoint. Hence, Sankaracharya revived rituals, built monastic institutions, and positioned devotion as the necessary stage for most people. His commentaries show this very clearly. And the cultural impact was enormous. Inquiry became limited to monastic elites. The masses were guided toward devotion, not questioning. Education became temple based and ritual focused. Debate culture declined across the subcontinent. After the 10th century CE, India's scientific output drops sharply. This is not an opinion, it's a visible pattern in the historical record. For nearly 7 centuries, between the 900s to the 1600s, India produced extraordinary poetry and devotional literature, but very little new science. To summarize, the 900s to the 1600s CE, more than 7 centuries were dominated by bhakti movements, ritual learning, commentary on commentary, and very little new science. The Kerala school of astronomy and mathematics between the 14th to 16th century was a rare exception, but overall, innovation drastically slowed down because the intellectual culture shifted from understand yourself to follow the tradition. When conformity rises, creativity falls. A huge setback for science from the 10th to 17th century CE. Now to the next era between the 18th to 20th century CE during the British colonization of India. British education, despite its colonial violence, reintroduced secular education. This was the Second Awakening. British education, despite its colonial violence, reintroduced secular, rational, scientific learning. And suddenly, India produced Ramanujan, early 1900s, C.V. Raman, 1930 Nobel Prize winner, Jagdish Chandra Bose, who presented several inventions during the late 1800s, early 1900s, S.N. Bose, who was famously known as the Bose-Einstein statistics. This not because Indians changed, but because the intellectual environment changed. When inquiry returned, innovation returned. So, what's the lesson for today and for our children? History shows something profound. When India focused on self inquiry, it led the world in science. When the culture shifted to God centric devotion, innovation slowed. When rational education returned, creativity exploded again. This isn't about religion, it's about how ideas shape cultures. Civilizations don't decline when they lose God, they decline when they lose curiosity. And this brings us to today. There's one more important thing we rarely talk about. When we introduce religion too early, before a child's reasoning skills are fully formed, we may unintentionally teach them to rely on external authority instead of their own judgment. Developmental psychology shows that children think in absolutes. If you tell them a higher power controls everything, they often internalize it as, I'm not in control. I shouldn't question. Thinking differently is dangerous. This also led to the overemphasis of the culture of memorization versus understanding. Religious obedience can create fear of thinking differently, reduce self confidence, reliance on an outside power, hesitation to question, discomfort with uncertainty. Children need to build their thinking muscles first, their ability to question, reason, analyze, and understand. Only then can they engage with religion in a way that is healthy, autonomous, thoughtful, and not rooted in fear or obedience. So, the real question for every parent is simple. How much religious exposure do you want to give a child before they have learned to think for themselves? Are you aware of the long term consequences? Kids who grow up with an external power controls everything concept often develop less confidence, less courage, and more dependence on authority. If we want the next generation to innovate, to lead, and have the courage to stand apart from the herd, we must first protect their ability to think freely before we teach them what to believe. Curiosity first, belief later. That's how strong minds are built.